Today we're going to look back at 15 Boxing Day meals only true Canadians remember. The dishes that filled quiet houses once the wrapping paper was gone and the snow outside turned blue in the afternoon light. For most families, December 26th wasn't about shopping or sales. It was about making something good from what was left. Christmas dinner had stretched wallets thin, but Boxing Day stretched the leftovers just as far. The smell of gravy reheating on the stove was as familiar as the sound of the hockey game on the radio, and the soft clink of cutlery signaled that the celebration still had one more chapter. The meal that defined the day was the hot turkey sandwich. Thick slices of yesterday's bird laid across buttered white bread, gravy poured until it soaked through the plate. Dominion Bureau records from 1965 put turkey at about 38 cents a pound, a luxury by working-class standards, so nothing ever went to waste. Every family had its own version. Some used brown bread, some added peas or carrots on the side, others a spoonful of cranberry sauce for color. Mothers stood at the stove with ladles in hand while the kettle hissed behind them, and the steam fogged the kitchen windows until you could barely see the snow piling up outside. For children, it was the easiest way to relive Christmas dinner without the ceremony. For grown-ups, it was quiet proof that thrift could taste like comfort. When the plates were cleared, attention turned to the Boxing Day pie, that glorious patchwork of leftovers that never tasted the same twice. Bits of turkey, spoonfuls of stuffing, diced vegetables, even the last streaks of cranberry sauce, all tucked beneath a lid of golden pastry. It baked while families watched the World Juniors or played cards at the kitchen table. When the crust rose and split, the smell drifted through every hallway, richer than any candle could make it. Prairie cooks bragged that their pies could feed a crowd twice over, and they usually did. A single tin could become lunch, supper, and midnight snack, proving that thrift and pride often shared the same plate. For those who favored creamy comforts, there was turkey a la king. The recipe had wandered north from hotel menus but found a permanent home in Canadian kitchens by the 1960s. Chopped turkey met peas and mushrooms in a white sauce thickened with flour and butter, sometimes brightened with a dash of sherry or paprika. Poured over toast or rice, it turned scraps into something almost elegant. Housewives loved it because it could be made in one saucepan, fewer dishes, more time to relax, and magazines like Chatelaine called it the sensible cook's encore. Somewhere in the background a record player crooned Bing Crosby, and the rhythm of whisk against pot became its own kind of holiday music. In many homes with British roots, bubble and squeak fried its way back into the day. Cold roast potatoes and cabbage were chopped together and pressed into a pan until the edges crisped and the vegetables popped and hissed. The noises that gave it its name. Immigrant families who'd crossed the Atlantic a decade earlier said it tasted like home, only better, with real Canadian butter and bacon fat. The smell of frying vegetables mingled with the scent of coffee, and for a moment it felt like two worlds meeting over breakfast. Grandparents swore it kept you warm longer than any wool sweater, and on icy mornings they were probably right. Not every dish was born from invention. Some simply gathered what was left and baked it together. The turkey casserole was the quiet hero of countless small-town kitchens. Layers of stuffing, shredded meat, and mashed potatoes pressed into a Pyrex dish, dotted with butter and slid into the oven until the top browned. A spoonful of cranberry sauce on the side cut through the richness, and suddenly the simplest meal of the week felt festive again. Newspaper food columns in the mid-1960s called it economy cooking, but no one at the table cared about labels. It was hearty, filling, and familiar, exactly what a long winter day required. By evening, the house would grow still, the radio softened, Dishes clinked in the sink, and outside, snow plows rumbled down the street. Inside, the kitchen still carried the scent of butter and onions, of gravy and pastry, of families making do together. That was the real spirit of Boxing Day in Canada, not the crowds at the mall, but the quiet satisfaction of turning yesterday's effort into today's comfort. Every province had its own small variation. In Ontario suburbs, a casserole might sit beside homemade pickles labeled in a neighbor's handwriting. In Nova Scotia, a pot of leftover soup already simmered for tomorrow. Across the prairies, people compared how long they could stretch their turkey, half joking, half proud. It wasn't competition, it was community, the shared understanding that thrift done with care could feel like abundance. When the last plates were stacked and the lights dimmed, the fridge held a few smaller containers, cold gravy, half a pie, a wedge of stuffing, promises for tomorrow's lunch. And as the night settled in, you could almost measure the country's heartbeat by the hum of those refrigerators, keeping memories cool until morning. As the morning drifted into afternoon, many kitchens turned their attention to something that had been waiting in the icebox since Christmas Eve, the tourtière. In Quebec, no Boxing Day table felt complete without a slice of that spiced meat pie, made with ground pork or a mix of beef and veal, flavored with cinnamon, cloves, and a hint of allspice. It was as much a tradition as the carols still echoing from the radio. Families who had attended midnight mass the night before often baked an extra pie for the next day, setting it on a snow-covered porch to cool before reheating it for lunch. The crust flaked against the fork, the filling steamed with a fragrance that could make any neighbor stop mid-stride. Even families outside Quebec tried their hand at it by the 1970s, thanks to recipes printed in Chatelaine and the Canadian Home Journal. A true tourtière didn't just feed a family, it carried the comfort of generations. For others, Boxing Day meant a long simmering pot on the stove. Once the bones were stripped bare, the turkey soup began, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Carcasses, onion ends, celery leaves, and the last handful of carrots went into an enamel pot covered with water and left to bubble slowly through the afternoon. The kitchen filled with steam and the smell of bay leaves and peppercorns. Some mothers tied herbs in bits of cheesecloth. Others just tossed them in and hoped for the best. You could tell which houses were making soup by the clouded windows and the steady clatter of ladles against pot rims. For children playing outside, that smell meant warmth was waiting. It was the quiet rhythm of post-holiday life, simple, steady, forgiving. In many Maritime and Newfoundland homes, another pot stood close by. Split pea soup, sometimes called peas pudding. Dried yellow peas soaked overnight, then cooked down with a leftover ham bone until they turned thick and golden. Served with brown bread and a knob of butter, it was both breakfast and supper, depending on how long the storm had lasted. Old family recipe columns in the Halifax Mail Star listed pea soup as a staple for the day after Christmas, proof that this humble dish had outlasted every trend. In coastal towns where winter isolation was real, that pot on the stove meant security. The sweet, smoky scent of ham, the slow bubbles breaking the surface, the spoon standing upright when it cooled, all tiny assurances that the household would make it comfortably through to New Year's. Not every family stayed by the stove. In some homes, the oven stayed quiet while the carving knife worked instead. Cold glazed ham was the centerpiece of countless Boxing Day buffets, sliced thin and served with mustard, relish, and homemade pickles. It sat proudly on sideboards beside trays of buttered rolls, ready for whoever wandered through hungry after a walk or a nap. Supermarket flyers from 1968 advertised smoked hams at 59 cents a pound, and for many households that meant a rare luxury stretched across several meals. There was something deeply Canadian about the contrast. Cold ham, warm fire, quiet music from a transistor radio. Some families added pineapple rings from a tin, a modern flourish borrowed from magazine covers. Others kept it plain, trusting the glaze of brown sugar and mustard to do the talking. Either way, it was food meant to share without ceremony. By the late 1970s, Canada's kitchens had begun to change. Supermarkets now carried soy sauce and frozen vegetables year-round, and families eager for new flavors found creative ways to use up their leftovers. One of the earliest experiments was turkey fried rice, a dish that quietly reflected the country's growing multicultural mix. Leftover turkey was diced fine, tossed into a frying pan with day-old rice, peas, carrots, and a splash of soy sauce that hissed the moment it hit the heat. It was quick, fragrant, and a sign of the times. Canadian Turkey Council pamphlets from the decade even featured recipes for it, calling fried rice the modern cook's shortcut to satisfaction. For kids, it felt exotic. For parents, it was one more way to stretch the bird. In small prairie towns where Chinese cafes lined main streets, it was a familiar flavor finally brought home. The scent of garlic and soy mingled with wood smoke from nearby chimneys. For a moment, it felt like the world was quietly widening, one frying pan at a time. As evening fell, kitchens across the country took on that particular hush unique to December 26th, the sound of wind pressing against windows, the creak of floorboards, the clink of spoons against bowls. Each meal that day carried its own kind of peace. Tourtière warmed the air with spice. Soup steadied tired hands. Ham and rice filled plates without fuss. None of it was glamorous, but every bite belonged to a rhythm older than any recipe book. Use what you have, feed who you love, and rest while the snow falls. Long before Boxing Day became another excuse for door-crasher sales, it was a home-cooked interlude between celebration and ordinary life. These dishes weren't just food. They were the country's way of saying the season wasn't quite over yet. The laughter had quieted, the gifts were opened, but the kitchens still worked their gentle magic. And somewhere, just beyond the glow of a frosted window, another pot began to simmer. By the third day of leftovers, some families began to reinvent the feast altogether. What once filled platters and roasting tins found new life in deep dishes and casserole pans. The most common transformation was shepherd's pie made with turkey, a thrifty twist on the classic. Leftover mashed potatoes spread over layers of chopped turkey, peas, and carrots, all baked until the top turned golden and crisp around the edges. Mothers mixed a little gravy into the filling to keep it moist, while children argued about who'd get the browned corners first. In small-town kitchens, this dish wasn't just supper. It was the quiet reminder that good food didn't end with Christmas Day. Dominion grocery ads in 1972 even called it the homemaker's holiday saver, proof that the nation's frugality had a proud place on the table. Farther east, along the coasts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, families leaned on something even older, rappy pie, a dish born from Acadian tradition. It turned grated potatoes and chicken broth into something between a casserole and a memory. Making it was slow work, squeezing moisture from potatoes by hand, layering them with bits of meat, and baking for hours until the top crisped and the inside turned silky. The scent was unmistakable, filling wooden farmhouses long before dawn broke over frozen fields. In Yarmouth County, entire families gathered to make multiple pans at once, sharing both the labor and the laughter. By the time it came out of the oven, the snow had usually stopped falling, and there was just enough left to bring to a neighbor's door. It wasn't fancy, but in many Acadian homes, rappy pie was the real heart of the holiday, a meal that told you who you belonged to. Not every Boxing Day dish was savory. Some came straight from the dessert trays that had survived Christmas night. Butter tart pudding was one of those miracles of thrift that only Canada could claim. Old butter tarts crumbled into a glass dish, soaked with milk and beaten eggs, then baked again until the kitchen smelled of caramel and toasted pastry. The texture fell somewhere between pudding and pie, soft in the middle, chewy at the edges. Food columns in Prairie newspapers like the Regina Leader Post called it a sweet way to clear the tins. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. The taste was rich, familiar, and comforting, the kind of sweetness that made long winters feel shorter. For households that still had leftover ham, there was scalloped potatoes with ham, one of those dishes that could feed a crowd without costing $1 more. Thinly sliced potatoes layered with diced meat, onions, and a sauce of milk thickened by nothing more than trust and time. You could hear the bubbling from the oven before the smell reached the hall. Every province seemed to have its version, a little more cheese in Ontario, more onions out west, a dash of mustard in the Maritimes. By the 1970s, recipes for scalloped potatoes appeared in nearly every church cookbook and ladies' auxiliary pamphlet. It wasn't just a side dish, it was the sound of contentment, a casserole that stretched until everyone was fed. And then there were the cold turkey and pickle plates, the simplest of all but somehow the most Canadian. Leftover slices arranged on patterned china, flanked by sweet pickles, sharp cheddar, and crusty rolls. They appeared at kitchen tables and television trays alike, often eaten while the World Juniors played in the background or while someone thumbed through the Eaton's catalog, marking what they might buy next year. There was no ceremony, no recipes, no heat required, just quiet satisfaction in every bite. A house might be half cleaned, the tree still shedding needles, and yet that cold plate made everything feel complete. By the time dusk settled across the snow banks and the last of the gravy dishes were washed, the season had found its gentle landing. The laughter of Christmas had softened, the music on the radio turned mellow, and the house itself seemed to exhale. Across Canada, from Quebec's kitchens to prairie farmhouses to coastal towns clinging to the Atlantic wind, Boxing Day was never just a day for leftovers. It was a pause, a soft space between celebration and routine, when people measured their blessings not in gifts but in the meals that lingered after. Every family's table looked different, but the feeling was the same. Steam rising from a casserole dish, the clink of cutlery against old plates, a hand passing the mustard jar across the table without needing to ask. These small, ordinary gestures stitched a country together more tightly than any grand tradition ever could. The beauty of Boxing Day was its simplicity, the way it invited people to stay home, stay warm, and stay grateful. And as night deepened, fridges across the country hummed quietly, their shelves stacked with foil-wrapped pies and jars of relish. Somewhere a kettle whistled, somewhere else a pot of soup cooled beside a window rimmed with frost. These were the sounds of a Canadian holiday in its second act, slower, softer, but just as full of love. The big day had come and gone, yet somehow, sitting there in the glow of the kitchen light, it still felt like Christmas.